Let's consider the possibility of the open gift-giving market as the primary structure that operates within intra-bioregional trade, rather than merely as a means of gift-giving the surpluses. In the first pass-through, we've simply held to the notion that absent money, all the existing agreements between various industries can still be honored. The rewards, again, being maximal for doing so for everyone involved, free access to all the goods and services within a given set of bioregions. Though it hasn't been explicitly stated in the successive pass-throughs of the Moneyless Free Labor Society, all existing agreements are essentially retooled to functionally operate within the constraints of the various renewal rates, and their primary focus shifted to that of short supply lines, bioregional constraints, etc. Such entails a lot of restructuring, changing in jobs, and it is argued that such sources out all the surplus labor via the hands of labor, gifting it back to the laborers, who in turn effectively do the labors of the home, which are valuable labors, and in turn thereby further diminish the requirements of labors outside the home. In terms of consideration as to the exact hows of accomplishing this, there is the curiosity regarding if an open gift-giving market, set with proper restraints, is capable of actualizing the Moneyless Free Labor Society on its own. Note, this relates to many of the aspects discussed in the inter-bioregional trade section as a whole, and may also address various questions as to who makes decisions overall. To reiterate, we already know that on an individual, familial, and local community level, open gift-giving is a normal practice with a very long history to it, and that it functionally operates. Its limits have tended to be exactly related to the limits of the individual, family, and community to do the relevant labors. In the current, organized labor of any sort is, and in some sense always has been, the question. Little surprise that lots of folks working together can produce more than individuals and familial units. The question can in some sense be fruitfully rephrased as, how do we get people to work outside the familial structure? The classic solutions to this having been versions of fiat, senses of duty, honor, community, generosity, need, using money, etc. In an open gift-giving market, all industries list their goods and services available, and list their various needs to produce said goods and services. The listing system itself directs people towards shorter supply lines, locally sourced goods being used first. The system itself contains the bioregional renewal rate limits. Such may dovetail well with the basic mechanics of the hands of labor, the open labor market of freely chosen labor, wherein in essence there is a listing of the various labors available within any given community, with some sense of priority listing. Essential labors may be listed as such, and basic listings of what the labor is producing, perhaps with details amounting to all the intra- and inter-bioregional trade aspects involved. From the laborer's perspective, such isn't that different from the current. Some of the guesswork of labor in determining what jobs to pursue is removed. Here I am thinking rather specifically as regards notions of seeking after high-paying jobs that don't really materialize, or starting small businesses that aren't particularly relevant, or making decisions predicated on money in general for that matter. When laborers understand the various needs, wants and desires of a local community, and more broadly, of a bioregion, all adjacent bioregions, and all non-adjacent bioregions, their motivations do change. No one forces them or manipulates them towards this or that job. Instead, laborers are trusted to make reasonable decisions providing that they have access to good information. Without concern regarding chasing money, understanding that this or that job essentially provides the same rewards. Free access to all available goods and services, there is no particular reason to prefer this or that job beyond 1. Understanding the worth of what goods and services such a job provides for people and for which people. 2. Their own personal interests, passions, talents, etc. 3. The worth and effects that such a job has upon the environment locally and as a whole. From industry's perspective, however, such is quite radically different. In the current wherein industry has to contend with the issues of money regarding their supply lines, oft it is the case that sourcing locally is more expensive, even if it is available. Such wouldn't be the case in the open gift-giving market. In terms of their general role, however, such isn't markedly different from the current. The various decision-makers within the relevant industries essentially determine how to supply their industries. Again, their motivations change, and their constraints change, but the essence of what they are doing largely remains intact. As noted, there is a tendency towards the creation and utilization of cottage industries in the system as a whole. After all, shortening supply lines entails a more localized industry structure. The notion of the open gift-giving market is that such cottage industries can be constructed by people through the metrics of existing industries deliberately shortening their supply lines. If an industry requires certain goods or services, they attempt to supply them via the most local route possible. If they cannot supply themselves within a given bioregion or any adjacent bioregions, they make a relevant note in the system that a local industry has thus and such unmet requirements within the relevant adjacent bioregions. Other industries have open access to those notes and can then determine if they are able to meet those requirements, perhaps by redirecting to whom they are currently supplying, perhaps by increasing production of the relevant goods or services, perhaps by starting an organization to produce those goods or services. Aside from industries that are dependent upon non-adjacent bioregional trade as such, no industry has any particular economic incentive to supply non-adjacent bioregions, though see the section on interbioregional trade. Hence, there isn't any issue regarding an industry trying to meet needs, wants and desires that are irrelevant to the local labor. This may avoid issues of trade tokens, specifically, the notion that each person has some particular limit relegated to the bioregional renewal rates, or any such notion of universal trade tokens as a means of regulating intra- or interbioregional trade. Each industry is already required to work within the relevant constraints, as the hands of labor have incentives to reduce overall labor, hence a tendency to prevent overproduction, and a preference to letting other processes do the labor for them. The constraints provide the proper motivational factors to itself regulate and guide trade, or at any rate, to provide for such a secure grounding of trade that there isn't a further requirement of some kind of trade token to either incentivize or regulate trade. As noted elsewhere, there is good reason to suppose that there is significant worth in especially local government regulation. Here by regulation we are specifically referring to the regulating powers that money has towards distorting labor markets, towards moneyed markets. There remains significant incentives to reduce the overall rate of production in that by doing so industry is increasing the capacity of the system elsewhere. If an industry is using less of the resources, it enables some other industry to utilize more, frees up resources for potential entrepreneurship, and reduces the amount of labor that industry is doing. Plausibility of distinctions between publicly and privately held companies. Such distinctions are likely dependent upon the number of laborers within the company. Note that such is already within the current. Companies that list themselves on the stock exchange are by definition within a moneyed system, publicly held companies. Hence, such isn't any particularly significant change in the structure. And there is a distinction made between small, mid, and large companies based on their employee numbers. The notion of maintaining the distinction has a lot to do with the capacity of people to hold relevant positions of decision-making within various companies. A privately held company tends strongly towards nepotism, a publicly held company at least less so. I'd suggest that such be strongly related to the number of employees, rather than any particular decision made on the part of current owners, or more broadly, decision-makers due to the relevant incentives that creates. People prone to wanting to hold on to the relevant decision-making of a company, in other words, are thereby limited in their capacity of effective power of decision-making. It is perhaps perfectly fine, in other words, for a classical, small mom-and-pop business to pass it on in the family, open of course to competition with other businesses. It is another thing entirely for a large corporation with the capacity to make decisions that affect massive numbers of people to simply pass that on in the family. Such amounts to little kingdoms in practice. The relevant point therein is that such publicly held companies are in a meaningful sense not privately owned. Indeed, they are not owned by anyone at all. It is worth noting that they are not owned or controlled by the government either. Rather, they are run by local people who ostensibly control all the various aspects of the operations of the company. The details of the exact leadership model within such companies may vary, but the main thrust of it is that anyone from within the local labor force can potentially work their way to a leadership position within the company. Note that such models the existing publicly owned companies system just sans moneyed concerns, and in essence sans ownership concerns. Those who own it are those who effectively run the company. There isn't anything further to ownership than that. This delimits the ownership model away from the stock market modeling, but otherwise retains the basic structure in the current. Importantly, such doesn't wrest control of the decision-making from those who are running the company, though it does place as limit to such control upon those who are doing the labors associated with the running and doing of the company's business. This is mostly distinct from smaller privately held companies in terms of decision-making and capacity to pass down within a given familial line. Such large-scale companies likely require some legal norms to prevent folks in leadership positions from altering the leadership structure in attempts to gain effective ownership over the industry. However, I don't think such is necessarily massively different from existing norms in many publicly held companies. There are, in other words, existing methodologies for removing individuals in leadership positions within a given company, and existing methodologies for promoting individuals to leadership positions within a given company. Hence, we can get a sense of how the pragmatics of privately and publicly held companies would operate within an open gift-giving market system. Plausible equilibrium of systems. In the current, existing industries already have what would be called an equilibrium in their system of supply and demand. By and large, they understand where their supplies are coming from, where they are sending the goods and services they provide, etc., and these don't tend to change much. These can and do change, of course, but oft such changes are predicated upon moneyed concerns, such as chasing cheaper supplies, oft amounting to chasing cheaper labor, or various causes whereby their current supply lines are no longer capable of supplying them, or attempts to increase market share and hence requirements to increase their supply, or decreases in market share and hence requirements to decrease their supply. Much of these concerns, changes, and shifting around aren't particularly present within the Moneyless Free Labor Society. Since everyone is working for doof, there isn't any rationale at all to chase after cheap labor. There may be incentives to chase after labor as such as recruitment, retention, etc. But there isn't anything to the concerns of moving operations in order to find cheap labor, or worse yet, to avoid taxes. Market share is limited, and there isn't any particular incentive to increase or decrease it. Granting that supplying the relevant set of local bioregions does entail an interest in being supplied with quality goods and services. After all, they are largely supplying themselves, their families, local communities, etc. Hence there is some sense of movement within the system of increase or decrease in market share. However, such movements are generally capped via the bioregional restraints. Nor again is there any real incentive to chase after cheaper supplies. There are incentives regarding chasing after supplies as such, but the motivations, interests, etc. are all different, amounting to shortening supply lines as much as possible, and concerns regarding quality control of supplies. Noting that such quality concerns likely ought not override the imperative to primary locally sourced and shorten supply lines. Such amounts to quality control within the bioregional constraints. The potential concern and actual reality therein being that folks may chase after supposed higher quality supplies via interbioregional trade. Such may or may not be a huge deal, given that no other bioregion has any particular incentive to supply non-adjacent bioregions. There may be some envy that accrues via the differentiations that occur predicated upon the bioregional constraints in place, perhaps especially as they amount to the qualities of the supplies. However, such is not a bad thing. Bioregional variation is itself a good thing. Moreover, the suggestion is that the overall system itself prevents such envy from becoming an issue, as no given bioregion has any incentives to provide those supplies over the concerns of quality. Gentler readers ought note that the existing differentiations regarding quality are largely bullshit. Brand names and deliberately making lower quality goods and services simply in order to make more money entail a huge, really the vast swath of differences in quality in the current. One's Lux product is Lux via artificial scarcity, not meaningful differences in quality or craftsmanship available. See other discussions regarding luxury goods to get a sense of what is likely to be the case for production of quality goods in a moneyless free labor society. The point being that here we are speaking of quality more as it relates to the actual raw materials being used, and the tendencies for differentiations in styles that are likely to occur. Of these two, the former is the bigger concern, as it amounts to significant limitations on any given bioregion, insofar as such occurs. Of those concerns, such identifies nominally interesting instances of interbioregional trade. The latter of these concerns is solvable simply via the methods of adapted copyrights, see relevant section, and free sharing of techniques. The motivations for gift-giving on the open market as a matter of interbioregional trade having already been explained, And in this section, the systemization itself makes those kinds of distinctions via the embedded preferencing of shortened supply lines. There will very likely be instances wherein normal supplies are unavailable, and hence new supply lines need to be established, such as a local supply running out via some natural disaster or temporary requirements to fulfill the needs, wants and desires of some non-adjacent bioregion. A significant upshot therein is that each industry will tend towards a new kind of equilibrium, one that is more soundly structured, and which in a very meaningful sense may entail the capacity to let big computer, see the big computer section, effectively make such determinations regarding supplies. In the current, such is in many ways already the case. The big computer effectively already maps these kinds of supply lines out. People in leadership and most laborers on all levels of an industry tend to already know effectively how much labor, what to do, day to day, week to week, season to season, and year to year. Much of the variation in that amounts to changes via introductions of various other products and services, and the reasons previously stated in this subsection. Aside from the introduction of various other products and services, however, the kinds of changes in those metrics wouldn't be expected. It likely isn't the case, however, that big computer can realistically make such determinations entirely on its own, at any rate, not in the current. Moreover, it may be the case that people ought not want big computer to make all those kinds of decisions for them. The point, however, is that much of that kind of labor is effectively a computer program with various laborers overseeing it, feeding it the relevant data, etc. That such has been systematized via the metrics of money entails that it can also be systematized via the metrics of bioregional renewal rates, shortened supply lines, etc., towards a far more stable version. I'd go so far as to venture a guess that folks with the relevant skills could design computer modeling programs that offer suggestions, some of them sound, some of them not, as to how exactly to structure the system as a whole, perhaps even on a move-by-move basis towards its implementation. In regards to the open gift-giving market in particular, such systemizations via big computer entail a kind of normalcy in terms of how we would expect it to operate. In other words, the open gift-giving market provides for a valid, stable systemization of the supply lines. Section 14M. Big computer, scalarly relevant data expands on this notion a fair amount. Here, in addition to other things, we are noting that the open gift-giving market can pretty directly be structured via big computer via the guidelines in this piece. That in a significant sense, the open gift-giving market amounts to something akin to big computer in the current, and would continue as such in a moneyless free labor society systemization. Plausible simplification of distribution. As each distributor of various goods and services is listed with priority given to more local distributors, each industry will inherently shorten the supply lines of every distributor. That is, as they are not making such decisions predicated upon money, but rather predicated upon the metrics of shortening supply lines and remaining within the resource renewal rates. Moreover, as each industry lists its requirements with priority given to local suppliers, suppliers will tend towards providing the relevant goods and services, thereby simplifying the distribution networks. Such entails a generalized movement away from monoculturing of crops, and a diversification of the local availability of goods and services, which in turn entails opportunities for the creation of many small businesses and cottage industries. Briefly, as it relates to trade with non-adjacent bioregions, such entails a greater overall capacity to supply for those various needs, wants and desires, while at the same time limiting the necessity to do so. Briefly, as it relates to usage of slow renewables, shortened supply lines overall entails reduction in the usages of a wide variety of the slow renewables. Fewer large-scale mechanisms for transport, such as trains, cargo ships, cargo containers, perhaps fewer large trucks. Shortened supply lines via the open gift-giving market entails less distances traveled, and hence less usage of large-scale transport mechanisms. It may be the case that such entails better local train services, and hence improved public transport. The regearing towards local distribution entails more reliance on local and mass transportation methodologies, where local means bioregionally constrained. Hence, a tendency to provide for those methodologies. A bit intuitively, if much of the supply is coming from within the bioregion rather than from far distant bioregions, then the en masse transportation methods that are useful for intra-bioregional transport are to be expected. Practically, this means fewer cargo ships and more locally servicing trains. Though such is somewhat unclear and likely idiosyncratic to the bioregions, distribution networks, etc. Less need for storage of goods, etc., with more locally centered distribution networks. More of the goods provided are utilizable quicker. Relevantly shortened supply lines entails the capacity for greater precision in terms of how much of any given good is being produced in the first place. Potentially less need for packaging. As crops have less distance to travel, the need to preserve them lessens. Likewise, if a local utilizer of those goods is capable of using them rapidly, then it follows that there is less need to use packaging to keep them fresh. From the entrepreneur's perspective, such enables them to access the various goods and services available in a rather direct manner. Moreover, such presents them with a wide variety of options as to what exactly they may choose to do. In essence, if some non-adjacent bioregion isn't stepping in and supplying the needs, wants and desires of a given bioregion, then there are potentially greater needs, wants and desires that the entrepreneur can meet. The plausibility that especially small businesses will simply stop doing that particular kind of work as a matter of choice likewise entails a greater capacity of opportunities for individuals to fulfill those particular needs, wants and desires. In other words, the small mom and pop businesses that don't continue, not as a matter of not making enough money, but as a matter of not wanting to continue doing that labor, retirement, etc., increases, both because the number of mom and pop businesses increases, and because the requirements to work in general are lessened. Larger industries are less likely to simply stop doing their thing, but then, that may be desirable, as it may very well be desirable to have cottage industries and large-scale industries simply existing in perpetuity, changing more in the sense of what exactly they produce rather than having them stop producing at all. See, however, the capacity to rather straightforwardly make relatively large and quick transitions within this system, wherein defunct and old technologies aren't fighting for life. As in, they can simply stop doing their thing without concern for job loss as such. Though noted elsewhere in this piece, the concerns of labor resentment and types of labor are worth reiterating and given a bit more explanation in this section, as it relates to the pragmatics of implementation. Specifically, that dealing with labor resentment is a major component of implementation, as labor resentment is one reason folks have issues of trust or lusts for power and control, and modes of disrupting organizing practices. Likewise, labor resentment masks an important distinction: the in-home, out-of-home labor types. Once society is able to grapple that differentiation, a fair amount of the implementation problems go away. In the current system, with the aim of wealth generation, as wealth is an illusory concept structured on imaginary constructs, the imperative to work is essentially unlimited. I want to briefly give a bit of a humorous anecdote on the point. Strangers go to a strange land, and they find a people who value shiny seashells. They are willing to trade goods and services for these seashells. To the stranger this seems utterly absurd. They're just seashells after all. Oh, the natives say, but they're pretty, and look what we can do with them. We can make jewelry. And look what else we can do with them. We can trade them to someone else who makes some other good or does some other service for us in exchange for them. See how valuable they really are. The stranger looks at them very queerly and says, "That's insane. Now, gold, that's really valuable. See how shiny and pretty it is. See how rare it is. See how much labor is involved in getting it out of the ground. Now that is real value. That is something I can trade with other people to get them to give me other goods or do services for me." The natives of the land look at this person very queerly and wonder why they care so much about such a thing as gold. Of course, neither make any sense. Both are caught up in the illusory power of greed as a construct of value. Each seeking after something perhaps like meaning, perhaps like purpose, perhaps akin to power, perhaps akin to control. Each looking for something called intrinsic value. Some time later people decide something like the following: let's just play pretend with this value thing. Clearly there is no intrinsic value associated with this money stuff, this trade thing, so let's just make it up. Some folks of course still want to pretend that there was something intrinsic about the seashells, or the gold, or some other such thing. Perhaps art, how pretty it is after all. Alas, still no real value is had. These people simply made the problem worse, more ubiquitous. Was there a point to it? I mean, maybe. Maybe there was the point of determining the various needs, wants and desires of people. Maybe there was a point in determining the capacities of people to create beyond whatever limits were in place within any given bioregion. Maybe there was a point in getting people to break through such pragmatic limitations as they may have been stuck within, that is, their bioregion of origin. Maybe there was a point in directing the labor. Maybe there was a point in providing the venue and means to trade. Maybe. But is there any point at all once those things are achieved? What, after all, is of value, real value, within a life sans money? Labor resentment. That person over there isn't producing something of value. They're lazy, they're inefficient, they're doing nothing, they're not contributing members of society. In pragmatic terms, we may point to, for instance, most of the traditional trades, the farmers, the essential laborers, and say, not without reason, that they are the ones that are really contributing members of the society. Perhaps we can expand on that some, and point to the manufacturers that produce goods and services that improve the quality of life of people, and say that they too are the real contributing members of society. We ought, and too oft fail to recognize the reproductive labors of life as extremely valuable. The having and raising of babies, the maintenance of the houses, the education of the youth, etc., we may point to that and say, look, they too are the real laborers of society. The resentment runs deep. Each person trying to prove that they are the real contributors to the society. Each maintaining that they contribute something valuable, essential, necessary, or, if not strictly necessary, something that supplies the wants and desires of other people. All of it, of course, being labor of some sort, and not money or wealth at all. Handling this labor resentment is fairly critical in any society whatsoever. As a matter of pragmatics of implementation, handling this deep-rooted labor resentment is rather strikingly important as a means of modality of implementation. Folks are not likely to get on board with the whole thing unless their various labor resentments are dealt with. There are two aspects of the resentment worth considering. One is as a matter of material rewards. This, however, is handled neatly via the Moneyless Free Labor Society, as everyone has free access to all goods and services. That avenue for labor resentment largely dissipates. Hence, I won't be dealing with that aspect in this section. The other aspect has to do with types of labors, rather than rewards. Who does what jobs, what counts as real labor, and so forth. To this the answers are far more about the philosophical, technical, and pragmatic modes of understanding human life and societies than, say, any kind of technical data-driven facts sort of understanding. So, to the necessary laborers, we may hold something like the value of their essential services and goods as being worthwhile. But what, after all, do they want and desire? It isn't this, more essential labor. So, where do they turn? Is it not something like these kinds of things, festivals, games, social interactions, hobbies, faith activities, sexual activities, the activities of family, etc.? What to do with all that surplus labor indeed? What we may expect from such a thing as massive surpluses of labor, massive surpluses of goods and services. People don't simply stop doing things, they don't simply stop laboring, but the choices they'll make for labor? Very different indeed. Potlatches, community events, festivals, fun rides on fun devices, travel, games made for free, for people to play for free, new devices, new playthings, and so on. Music, art, crafts, all simply given away. Why? Because why not? And those essential laborers? What of them? I mean, realistically, these people freely partake in all those goods and services everyone else is providing. The sheer pent-up demand for such things within the current times is overwhelming, if that is, anyone has the capacity to feel such things, and if they lack that, perhaps at least they can understand why and how that is. People overworked, doing pointless labors that do little to nothing to worse than nothing to the detriment of the basics of life, the lack of celebration, the lack of enjoyment, the lacking of familial love, the lacking of community grace, the lacking and privation of all things good and holy. Would not the essential laborers rejoice in the revelry of such pragmatic things as what the non-essential laborers can provide? Still, we may rightfully ask, how do we divide up the essential labor? Perhaps more to the point, how do we ensure that we maintain the essential labor? Which bodies do the essential labor? There are some pragmatics to that, some, perhaps a great deal or all of it is primarily well divided up via the hands of labor. The Moneyless Free Labor Society simply incentivizes people within the constraints laid out towards such a place, minimizing the overall essential labor involved, in other words. Still within that limit we may, and really ought to ask, who does that remaining essential labor? In the pragmatics of the now, the people who are already doing that kind of labor. Such really can't be avoided, or, at any rate, not avoided without massive disruptions to all the existing systems. However, even within the short term, the massive surpluses of labor available entail that people can take on those kinds of essential labors. Indeed, in the short term, such essential labors are likely to increase in the sense of building the relevant infrastructures. In the short, mid and long term, we may reasonably well hold to something like the notion of retirement ages, as in the youth, relatively speaking, tends to do the essential labors. Wherein retirement is not really attached to anything at all like money, social security programs, government programs of any kind for that matter, but in any case retirement amounts to when someone has worked their quota of labor hours for their lifetime and little else. Given the massive surplus of labor, the massive surplus capacity to provide goods and services en masse, such a retirement age is not old age by any stretch of the imagination. While I cannot fiat a number from theory alone, given the degree of surplus labor currently in the system, as illustrated by the pandemic, we may be looking at retirement ages in the 30s or perhaps the 40s or 50s. Wherein retirement is retirement from the essential services. The labors of life still continue, but they differ to the point of more freely determining what kind of labor one is really doing. That is, retirement from the essential services entails more time to provide non-essential services, the various goodies in life. The crafts of hobbies, festivals, games, celebrations, community groups, etc., those things we all actually enjoy doing. As regards retirement, the labor resentment therefore may come from the youth towards the relative elders, in the sense of what labors are being done, by whom, when, etc. Among the pertinent points therein, though, is that by delineation predicated upon age rather than any other metric, generally speaking, no one is being privileged, as in, everyone theoretically can reach those ages. I know, not everyone, but then, that isn't exactly the point. Moreover, and again, it isn't the case that retirement means no labors, rather, it entails a kind of shifting of one's priorities away from what would be called the essential labors, to what would be called the joyful labors. Each is partaking in each, though. It isn't as if the essential laborers don't thereby also participate in the more joyful labors. It is that they are also tasked with the more essential labors, as a matter of pragmatics of learning, and the relative health of bodies more than anything else. Note that this point regarding the prioritizing of essential labors towards the youth dovetails well with the notion of how to delineate the various labors within any given industry. The entry-level positions, the on-the-job learning, the prioritizing of internal hiring, and so forth. The retirement and prioritizing also ought not necessarily be taken as a law, but rather as a strong cultural norm, and the essential services being an entry point in an industry, or simply an industry in general, rather than a strict sort of delineation of labor by age. Though, I also would point towards a sense whereby having the younger generations take command entails the retirement of the older generation, and that holding off too long on that also is a significant source of labor resentment. Hence, if not a law, certainly a very strong cultural norm. I suggest not a law, as a law may simply be too draconian a practice, too prone to catching people up in issues of enforcement that are likely more complicated and annoying than they are worth for something that ought to be a rather joyous kind of thing. That is, retiring to more joyful labors ought not be a thing of horrors, and the youth graduating to more leadership positions likewise ought to be a happy-making kind of thing. That said, those ages largely reflect a certain kind of cultural, sexed, and gendered dispositions, as opposed to bias, which carries far too many negative connotations worth exploring. Productive ages for different types of labor are dependent upon one's sex. This is just a biological fact, and the value of raging against it is not entirely clear. To be blunt, especially for females, sex term, the prime biological age of doing the real labors involved in the having and raising of children is in their youth. Likely biologically speaking between the ages of 16 and mid to late 30s. While it is true we can extend that to later in life, and we may even be able to extend that indefinitely in life via cloning and various other technological methodologies, sexual reproduction most likely remains by far the preferred methodology overall. Without getting into the somewhat odd, traditional roles of women argument in terms of what the body can do, how well it can recover from birth, in terms of the literal energy level that the person has to do that kind of labor, not just birthing but raising of kids, and in terms of the quality of the eggs and to a lesser degree the sperm, are all primed for youth. Hence, it is in especially the female's sex term best interest to tend to have whatever children they are going to have when they are young. For the male's sex term, the situation is similar, but not as extreme. Younger men are more physically capable, generally speaking, to do the tasks of raising children, just as younger women are. Likewise, though it isn't as extreme, males' sex term, sperm tends to be of higher quality when they are younger. At least, in the case of sperm and eggs, this is what the science is generally informing us of. Without getting overly genetic perfectionist on the topic, in terms of basic desires of people to have and raise kids for both the male and the female, the best time of their lives to do so is in their youth. When we consider this essential labor, this kind of consideration runs headlong into the question of who is doing that other essential labor in the society. If, that is, we were to hold that the youth in general ought to be doing that other essential labor of society, the trades, farming, etc., that leaves them less time, energy, and capacity to do the essential labors of raising children. One fairly neat and tidy solution to this issue is the overall reduction of work hours per household. This avoids the major issues involved with the gendered division of labor, in that each coupling is only expected to work 40 hours per week outside the home. Each individual therein can opt to work only 20 hours, or one individual work 40 and the other none, wherein it honestly ought to be understood that the person working no hours outside the home is expected to primarily be responsible for all the labors within the home. Such arrangements are of course left to the coupling to figure out, but if something the older generations of women have noted is that 40 hours of work outside the home kinda sucks. There are, in other words, some privileges that come with working within the home, especially in the modern era. Likewise, I'd say that something men have learned is that work in the home is real labor, especially if it includes such things as homeschooling, wherein the children are home pretty much all the time, and things like making home-cooked meals. See also Section 14K, Practicums of Education, and Section 14N, Pragmatics of Life. My intuition on this point is that radically going against the underpinning biology involved regarding timing of having children is not something desirable in general, and that people are not generally going to be overworked in their youth, wherein the expectation is 40 hours of work per week per household, where a household is generally but not exclusively understood as a coupling. I'd also note that it is unclear exactly how low the actual work requirement may end up being. The 40-hour-a-week per household limit doesn't actually account for all the surplus labor existing in the current, nor for that matter does it account for the increases in our capacities to produce. It is a figure derived as a conservative estimate, in that we know already we can go that low and still produce sufficiently. It may be the case that the actual workload outside the home is much smaller regarding essential labor. Indeed, I'd say such is highly likely. It's just not something that is a known or even reasonably guessable quantity at this point. It is something that is determinable, as noted elsewhere in this piece. Technically, the amount of labor as tied within the limit of renewal of resources and bioregional constraints are all determinable quantities. Indeed, that information is technically already known, it just isn't compiled in any kind of systematic manner. Dealing with the issues associated with labor resentment are practical aspects of implementation, as they entail getting folks on board with the system itself. Labor resentment underpins much the ado regarding money, control, and social organizations in general. That such labor resentment is gendered is of interest and worth noting. My strong suspicion is that labor resentment in part underpins gendered resentment. Handling either likely goes a long ways towards handling the other. Along those lines, see also the Rape of the Swan for aspects of understanding and practical methods of dealing with gendered resentment in the currents. If, in other words, we handle the gendered labor resentment aspects appropriately, and if we handle the retirement aspect appropriately as a matter of theory, argumentation, presentation, and so forth, then the aspects of labor resentment that are not about strict material differences is thereby handled. While the system as a whole as developed in moneyless free labor societies handles the issues of material differences. Hence, overall, the claim that thus are labor resentments justly handled. Given the degree whereby education is required to functionally create and maintain the various systems the species has, and indeed any future systems the species may have, the practicums of education are important. Education dovetails with the issues in Section 14J, Types of Labor and Labor Resentment, so there will be some overlap here. In general, in the current, our educational systems suck. That said, they are better than they used to be, say, 100 years ago or more, and far and away better than the before times of public education. In understanding educational systems, it is important to have a basic understanding of the relevant history. In short, education used to be provided in the home pretty much exclusively. The notion of public education was not really a thing until not that long ago, roughly 200 years or so ago. People in general simply did not receive anything like an education about the world at large, science, philosophy, mathematics, reading and writing, and so forth. This created a conundrum: how does one educate the educators? Wherein, the primary educators are in point of fact the parents. If the parents are uneducated, they will teach their children poorly. Hence, public education. After many generations of this, in places wherein this has occurred at any rate, we now have pretty well-educated educators. Currently, all the parents are actually remarkably well-educated compared to their ancestors, all appearances to the contrary aside. Moreover, in the current, we have the tools available for the primary educators, the parents, to utilize in educating their children, specifically the internets. In essence, not without its problems, everyone has the entire body of human lore more or less at their disposal via their computing contraptions. Moreover, there are a plethora of free educational programs available to them. The point therein is that homeschooling as a primary option is now capable of providing a far superior educational outcome than public education methods. There are some significant limitations therein though. Specialized education and higher education is not something that is generally plausible for an individual to provide. That is, at some point the students are better served by going to a public educational apparatus that can teach them about a wider variety of topics, and with more specialized depth than is really capable of being accomplished within a homeschooling environment. There are some meaningful variations on this point. Homeschooling co-ops can potentially accomplish the relevant tasks. Differing schooling models in the public sector, etc. The main point is that generally speaking, when students reach the high school age, they are very likely better served via public education, or at any rate, some non-insular to the home education. A related concern, somewhat dealt with elsewhere in this piece, is the role of practical on-the-job learning of a trade, skill, etc., rather than any kind of scholastic learning as such. In the pragmatics of life, such constitutes a very good method of teaching for a great deal of the relevant labors out there that need, or ought be done. Fetishizing university education and trade schools significantly diminishes that aspect of learning and pragmatics of the doing and living of life. As with other subsections in the pragmatics of implementation section, how this relates to the overall structure has a lot to do with the doing of things, the actual living of the relevant modalities of life, and to some extent a kind of forecasting as to what a moneyless free labor society may actually look like, especially within the currents of the species technology. Folks spending greater amounts of time raising their children, after all, is practically entailed via the reduction of surplus labor in the existing system. We might expect, for instance, that class size in public schools will drop, raising the overall performance of the public classroom. Which, to be blunt, is a good thing overall. It is a win-win kind of dynamic, in that folks capable of doing the homeschooling can do that labor, and folks not capable or willing to do that kind of labor have their kids given a higher quality education in virtue of lower class sizes. The incentives to do homeschooling are fairly great, and the tools available are basically free in the current, and are certainly free in the proposal being described here. The incentives being higher quality educational outcomes for one's children by and large, rewarding and fulfilling in-home labor, closer-knit familial forms, stronger loving bonds created, and very likely greater community involvement. As in practice, homeschooling entails utilization of community resources and labor, in addition to the prospects of homeschooling co-ops. The removal of surplus labor in the existing system further enables this, as it provides the necessary time available to do such things. At the same time, simply making the choice to do so itself actively removes surplus labor in the existing system. If, in other words, one parent is primarily educating the children, or if both parents are doing so, they are managing to do so by removing their labor from the existing system. And by doing so, they are thereby reducing the demand for that kind of labor in the existing system, or, at any rate, They are redirecting the labor in the existing system towards those kinds of goods and services that folks would need, want, and desire within a moneyless free labor society. There is another practicum of education that involves the providing of free education, and the providing of the tools of education for free, though as noted via the internets this has already largely, though perhaps not completely, been accomplished. And insofar as it has been accomplished, well, the internets has a lot of poor quality educational aspects therein to it too. Among the relevant lessons therein to learn, however, is that the internets are providing a free public education, and just as with other public educational systems that have been put in place, they start out somewhat lower quality, but as they educate the educators, they thereby gain in their quality over time, perhaps towards some upper limit of diminishing returns. But then, don't think the species is near that limit ATM. Likewise, the content of the education does actually matter. Without getting overly into it here, there is value in educating regarding multicultural living. The Internet provides for a multicultural experience in ways that were never available before in this species' history, at any rate. The point being that a multicultural education of some kind is something of a requirement for any and all educational operati and practices. Homeschooling the little ones in the current is likely a highly useful tool towards those ends. Rather specifically, as a means to actualize that aspect of the educational operati whereby it may not otherwise be actualizable. Anywhere, that is, where the public educational system is lacking in such things, the homeschooling internet educational operati provides for the plausibility of actualizing those aspects of the education. Such is going to be more or less relevant depending on where one is living, but noteworthy therein is that in terms of possible outcomes, a homeschooling methodology has the potential to provide for a far superior education on all fronts, including the multicultural aspect. Insofar as that aspect is done, such is useful for the implementation of a moneyless free labor society, as it undermines the nationalistic, political, and economic resentment structures in the current. Moreover, and finally in regards to this subsection, homeschooling and the internets can be utilized rather directly towards the implementing of a moneyless free labor society, simply through the efforts, labor, and virtues associated with teaching that such a society is the aim, the way the species ought to go, that towards which folks ought to strive, and the way through which folks ought to view the world. Such can get into somewhat propagandist territory if folks aren't careful with how they're teaching it. However, the moneyless free labor societies has the capacity to stand on its own merits. It isn't as if folks need really propagandize their students so much as teach them the merits, and allow them to grasp at the reasoning, rationale, ethics of it, the history, reality, and argumentation of it themselves. Teaching, education, is not the same thing as propaganda, and folks who would argue otherwise are almost certainly interested in propagandizing rather than education. The differences may be a bit subtle, but they are real and fairly important nonetheless. Here perhaps it is worth recognizing a systemic issue within the current form of the university systems. In some, they have largely been co-opted by both concerns for money and government. Of the former, such is notable as they generally didn't used to be run as businesses. Their focus wasn't generally limited to business concerns, profitability, or even such things as pragmatics. They were elitist institutions designed more or less to provide education for folks that were either particularly bright or came from the ruling classes. In other words, their mission more or less was to educate the leaders so the species isn't led by total dumbasses, and to pursue the virtues of intellectual pursuits for their own sake. Of the latter, the most crucial change happened via World War II and its aftermath, the Cold War. Universities were tasked by governments to produce certain kinds of workers. Such was a deliberate aspect to win the Cold War and to win World War II. We may bicker over the virtues of doing so as a historical matter, but in the current it is far more relevant for all the universities to seriously reconsider what their mission is. Is it really to do the bidding of governments and businesses? In a moneyless free labor society, there is a relevant functional role for universities to provide education for highly specialized and technical fields, to act as a meritocracy of quality control for a wide variety of disciplines wherein such is desirable. Who directs that, however, is not businesses or government, rather it is the prospect of serving the relevant needs, wants, and desires of people more generally. Absent the costs associated with learning these kinds of skills and trades, the prospects of people being willing and able to learn them greatly increases. That said, a lot of what is taught in universities can be taught via on-the-job training, even within these very technical fields. The usefulness of degreed education is fairly far overblown, in other words. See also the points previously made regarding the restructuring of jobs towards preferring internal hiring, entry-level positions, etc. Folks within the university system really ought to seriously consider how to reaffirm their original mission towards the negation of the current, whereby they are in effect servicing the purposes of businesses and governments. Within a moneyless free labor society, moneyed concerns obviously go away, though there may remain aspects of concerns regarding the practicums of business, trades, etc. Again, much of those, however, having much better educational and practical results from on-the-job training, and again, the main reason such was shifted was as a part of a wartime footing to try and force people to do certain kinds of jobs. Universities ought to also be understood as a rite of passage for the youth. They are a kind of finishing school structure, whereby they do in fact learn worthwhile things, for instance, how to think, not just critically think, but just how to think at all, also such things as history, philosophy, and some not insignificant number of more technical trades like engineering, the sciences, etc. They also service as a mode of first times living on their own kind of structure, and a bit less pragmatic of concerns, like quality of living. As in, the education itself can be geared towards improving the quality of living by gaining in awareness of a wide variety of aspects of life, differing cultures, etc. But also in the more immediate sense of having the experience be engaging, demanding, enjoyable, etc. Moreover, technically much of what is learnable within the university system is learnable online, oft, though not always, in a better format. The issues therein are at this point pretty well understood. How to navigate the mess that is the Internet is itself a major issue. The amount of lies, confusions, misinformation, etc. online is pretty astounding. Such suggests itself as a kind of task for folks within the university systems, who generally speaking are better capable of sniffing out the bullshit. Those kinds of skills are largely taught at a university level, I mean to say. To be clear on that point, given the reality of the Internet's I'd suggest that such is a good and valid kind of addition to give to the university mission, education so as to help handle the mess that is the internet's. I also want to give a bit more clarification as to the plausible usefulness and role of universities, beyond that of the technical aspects associated with certain labor concerns. Universities are storehouses of knowledge and culture in ways that are actually not plausible to be accomplished in any other way. Specifically, they are asymmetrical dynamic places of knowledge, whereby a multiplicity of peoples and perspectives are enabled to teach, interact, and continue the practice of knowledge and knowledge production in a manner that isn't really plausibly replicable even in an online or internet's format, within which a very specific sort of meritocracy, alluded to at the beginning of this piece, actually is in play. And to be clear, it is playfulness. That on its own, learning for the sake of learning, knowledge for the sake of knowledge, even competition for the sake of competition within the realm of understanding are all in and of themselves valuable as places, institutions, and cultural structures to have in place. Moreover, universities act as storehouses of cultural lore, wisdoms that are simply not in practice oft anywhere else on earth. There are dispositions, beliefs, cultural ways of living, that are maintained in universities that are otherwise simply not around anymore anywhere else. Or, for that matter, have never existed anywhere else on earth. These come about from the aforementioned asymmetrical, dynamically interacting peoples within the university systems. Without deliberately singling out any particular modality of living or cultural thought, some non-insignificant number of otherwise lost indigenous practices, wisdoms, lore, etc., existed within university systems, as understood by those within it. Likewise, too, for a great number of otherwise merely historical ancient, cultural practices, beliefs, norms, etc., whereby such things are granted a kind of providence and stature that are otherwise lacking in whatsoever happens to be the dominant local, cultural practice of the day, whatsoever happens to be trending here or there, and largely regardless of whatever the concerns of wealth, privilege, or power may be. Such places model in a meaningful sense at least some ways whereby otherwise distinctive peoples can interact with each other, in a non-horrible manner. That in and of itself is strikingly valuable. But I want to also strongly suggest that as a generalized cultural rite of passage for the youth, universities are highly valuable. As they exit whatever their otherwise fairly insular educations may have been when they enter into the university systems, they are provided a far more diverse and rich sort of understanding of the world, as it is via exactly the aforementioned cultural storehouses of wisdoms and knowledge. That such would be thought of as only having relevance insofar as it makes money, is of such humorousness that it ought to bring folks to tears, of one kind or another. The notion, rather bluntly put, is that universities ought to be understood as a rite of passage for the youth, not just as educational operati, though that they are, nor even as storehouses of wisdoms, nor merely as locations to learn a job, get a job, make some more money, nor even as places to win a Cold War. Though universities have been all these things, which ought also say something of their value. They ought to be understood and utilized as places whereby the youth go to have the relevant experiences of a multicultural reality that they aren't going to be getting within the pre-university education and into which they are going to be living regardless, whereby such a place is built to be playful, fun, joyful. Re-gearing universities in this fashion entails simply a doing, a bringing forth of significant aspects of the moneyless free labor societies. Their existence in such a way going a long ways towards the eventuation of the overall restructuring of societies. Recalling again that money is no object. On the broadest of scales, namely, on the level of bioregional resource renewal rates, as noted before, these things are all technically quantifiable. The broad ecological structures likewise are largely technically quantifiable. Human behavior is in some sense technically quantifiable for that matter. Moreover, all these kinds of data are largely already in existence, many of them centralized in various locations, governments, big corps, and universities, as well as some decentralized locations. How that kind of information is utilized is of fairly critical ethical concern. If it is utilized towards the manipulation and control of people, say for instance how the Chinese government is doing so, or via any number of big corp X's and Y's are currently, the outcomes are pretty radically undesirable. If it is utilized towards the ends of making money, such is likely pretty radically undesirable. The suggestion here, however, is that much of the scalarly large aspects of the species' relevant behaviors in pragmatic terms can in essence be uploaded to big computer, rendering much of the aspects of big government and big corp fairly superfluous. The suggestion is that when the renewal rates of the bioregional resources are well-known quantities, big computer can largely keep track of that kind of information, ensuring that the human species' behaviors, labors, innovations, trading, etc., all stay within those limits. Likewise, big computer can technically keep track of all relevant information towards the ends of supply, though notably and perhaps critically not demand, as the species' demands may shift. Big computer simply adjusts to better supply those demands within the relevant bioregional constraints, imperatives for shorter supply lines, etc. Demand is restrained by the hands of labor. Big computer doesn't really have meaningful eyes and ears, let alone hands on the ground to do the labors, and realistically the species very well may not want that kind of thing. Here folks would do well to recognize that big computer as a concept is a decentralized structure, with human nodal components to it. Specifically in regards to the open gift-giving market, the human species constitutes one element of big computer, the hands, eyes, ears, legs, productive capacities and demand source of big computer. Big computer as a structure ought not be construed in so literal a sense as a giant fucking computer in a room somewhere. Big computer is the overall networked structures of humans interacting via the internets, each human constituting a nodal component to the overall structure. Big computer does, however, also entail its own structural components that are a lot like giant fucking computers in rooms, that do a lot of processing and algorithmic structuring of the relevant data. Understanding big computer in this manner entails that there is more to the concept than merely a series of programs. The integration of the human components in the conceptual and ultimately practical framework as interactive nodal components entails that there is within the whole the human artistry, emotive capacities, and in some the human experiences without being subsumed by big computers' programs and algorithmic structures. The dependency of big computer upon the human nodal structure simply demands these aspects are maintained. They define the structure. This strongly pushes back against notions in the current of cyborgs entailing literal computer chips being implanted in people, and so forth. Without strongly prejudicing against such practices, I simply shall call them quite quaint, and oddly literalistic in their understanding of the world. Perhaps in need of some help. Concerns regarding criminal activity through the use of big computer are valid, but like with many things, likely overblown. Recalling that within the Moneyless Free Labor Society, much of the impetus towards criminal activity is simply eliminated, and many of the underpinning causes of violence are likewise eliminated. Though we ought note that it is unclear to what degree that may thereby eliminate or radically reduce instances of criminalization, the not at all unreasonable assumption is that it will largely do so. Big computer is of course limited in its capacity to understand the situation, predicated as it is upon the species providing it relevant input. Notable within that, however, is that big computer can simply be programmed to find solutions that, for instance, don't involve war. Hence the rationale for Big Brother or Big Corp to keep an eye on things is likewise largely removed. Much of the practical function of that kind of labor is relegated to the big computer, noting though that such is about scale, that is, those kinds of decisions are scalarly large. And to be clear, the notion is not to monitor the people, the notion is the determination of intra/interbioregional trade being modeled, specifically as it relates to the proper joint-carved restraints, shorter supply lines, etc. Such likely isn't particularly different from the open gift-giving market. The open gift-giving market being a modality of utilization of big computer, whereby the human interface is exactly geared towards smaller scalar interactions, human scalar interactions, and largely intra-bioregional trades, rather than attempting to consider the broader scalar data and ramifications thereof. In essence, or at least in short, bigger scalar data is managed via big computer, which effectively presents an array of viable options within which individuals, and a bit more generally speaking, smaller scalar entities and considerations are chosen. Big computer doesn't generally inform as to what labors peoples do, though it may and perhaps ought to signal when certain labors really ought be done or stopped. In other words, warning if our freely chosen labors are risking breaking the renewal rates of the resources, or if certain necessary labors are not being done, or warnings as to if certain labors towards wants and desires are not being done. Choice remains with the laborers, though in the case of necessary labors it may be reasonable to again have some kind of fail-safe enforcement. Likewise, in terms of producing beyond the renewal rates, having a fail-safe in place to enforce them may be warranted. Such fail-safes generally ought be done at the most local level possible, ensuring the smallest degree of governmental control. See also previous discussions on this point. Likewise, we would expect there to be degrees of overuse, that is, overusing a resource such that it cannot renew within a reasonable amount of time, versus overuse of a resource wherein it can be renewed within a reasonable amount of time. Wherein reasonable amount of time may be something akin to generational markers, somewhat vague and overlapping, but roughly speaking within the lifetime of the people using them. Such can be detailed or not, and I'd suspect that ultimately reasonable markers would become more apparent as the system is used. Such isn't a system that determines in any meaningful sense the amount of labor we do. That is largely within the bounds of the hands of labor as such. Big computer provides a kind of insight for the hands of labor to utilize more or less as they see fit. The rationale therein being at least in part to avoid the trap of master's whip, wherein someone else is definitively determining exactly what labor and how much of it laborers ought to do. Granting again that the ultimate amount of work hours actually required to meet the various needs, wants and desires of the people remains an unknown, though again the conservative safe estimate of 40 hours per week per household is a good start, and again given the massive surplus of labor in the current we should expect that amount of labor to drop. As well noted within section 14J, types of labor, labor resentment and elsewhere in this piece, what we actually mean by drop in work hours really depends on how folks are understanding labor. Overall labor hours may increase in some sense, as it takes labor to create festivals, hobbies, crafts, community networks, making, having and raising babies, home improvements, etc. The difference, of course, is that those labors are not really being done via force. They are the sorts of labors the species generally prefers to do. What we mean by reduction in work hours is roughly what we typically refer to as those kinds of labors that occur outside the home, working for big core, manufacturing, etc. Ultimately, these categories are somewhat superfluous, but do point to a meaningful distinction: labors that are freely chosen, labors that are merely necessary, and labors that produce goods and services that would be wanted and desired, but not manifested through merely freely chosen labor and/or merely necessary labors. Similarly, the distinctions between in-home and out-of-home labor, while meaningful, can be muddied. Worth mentioning that with the reduction of all the surplus labor, we may rather easily get within the renewal rates of the bioregions. Simply implementing the system without making any additional deliberative drastic changes as such likely puts the species pretty well within the renewal rates of the various resources. With perhaps the aforementioned moratorium on commercial fishing for a few years to bring the stocks of marine life back, and perhaps similar measures in particular instances regarding various resources. Likewise, as kinda noted throughout this piece, the imperatives towards rejuvenating the various bioregions is not really a small task at hand for labor. Halting the surplus labor will help that a fair amount. Massive reductions in the overproduction of the various bioregions enables all the other living systems to do their thing and rejuvenate themselves after all. Still, there is almost certainly labor on the horizon for people to do towards those ends. Such constitutes a rough outline of how Big Computer can functionally operate to orchestrate the relevant data that the hands of labor needs in order to make well-informed decisions. Likewise, to structurally enforce the shorter supply lines rule structure, such that the whole thing is capable of being run without recourse to the pitfalls associated with having some particular organizational structure in charge of making those kinds of decisions. It is argued here that this understanding of Big Computer also avoids the potential pitfall of Master's whip, taking the form of Big Computer. Big Computer doesn't determine if, when, or what it is that the hands of labor does. Big Computer provides guardrails against the possible stupidity of the hands of labor, structural soundness of bioregional constraints that are not easily or realistically comprehensible for most people, and certainly not at any given point. In other words, Big Computer is capable of handling the scalarly large kinds of activities that the individual human isn't really capable of handling, and realistically isn't really interested in handling. Concerns of human freedom lay fairly firmly within the realm of individual actions, and not within the larger scalar bioregional structures. One can understand Big Computer as a kind of balance to human activities that have a larger scalar effective force upon the bioregional structures. A balancing that avoids the catastrophes of human foolishness.
Okay, this